Hello. Jorge Luis Borges, whom some consider to be one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, is best known for his work that plays with ideas such as identity, reality and language. His work, which includes poetry, essays, stories and reviews, had a great influence on magical realism and literary theory. He viewed the realist novel as overrated and deluded, revelling instead in fable and in imaginary worlds. He declared, quote, "People think life is the thing, but I prefer reading," unquote. Translations form an important part of his work. He wrote a Spanish-language version of an Oscar Wilde story when he was aged about 9. He went on to introduce other key writers such as Faulkner and Kafka to Latin America, liberally making changes to the original work which went far beyond what was, strictly speaking, translation. He lived most of his life in intellectual obscurity, finding recognition only in his 60s when he was awarded the International Publishers' Prize, which he shared with Samuel Beckett. By this point he was blind, but continued to write, composing poetry in his head and reciting from memory. So how has Borges' work informed ideas about our experience of the world through language? And how has his legacy inspired the next generation of Latin American authors such as Gabriel, Garcia Marquez, Maria Vargas Llosa, and those beyond South America? Joining me to discuss the life and work of Borges is Edwin Williamson, Professor of Spanish Studies at Oxford University and author of a recent biography on Borges. Efraín Kristal, Professor of Comparative Literature at University of California, Los Angeles, and Evelyn Fishburn, Professor Emeritus at London Metropolitan University and Honorary Research Fellow at University College London. Edwin Williamson, let's begin with Borges the man and his background, his rather extraordinary family.
Well, Borges came from a very distinguished Argentine family. Among his ancestors, he could count conquistadors, Spanish conquistadors, colonial governors, even one of the founders of the city of Buenos Aires. There were two ancestors he was especially proud of and who were revered by the family. One was Colonel Isidoro Suarez, who distinguished himself in the Wars of Independence. He led a cavalry charge in the Battle of Junín, one of the final battles against the Spanish, and he was promoted to colonel by Simón Bolívar himself. And the other great hero in the family was Colonel Francisco Borges, who was his grandfather on his father's side, and who was a distinguished soldier who had commanded various garrisons on the Indian frontier, who had put down a number of Gaucho rebellions, but who had been killed in battle in 1874. Now, these two great family heroes were revered by the Borges family. Their swords were displayed on the walls of the house. They had pictures all over the house and all their various objects displayed for people to see. And it was particularly on the mother's side, his mother's side, she derived a very strong sense of being a patrician Argentine. In fact, the Acevedo family, her native maiden name, had come down in the world. Their lands had been confiscated by the dictator Rosas in the middle of the 19th century. And much of Doña Leonor Acevedo de Borges' motivation in life seems to have been to restore the glory and status of the family.
And in that sense, her son was a bit of a disappointment.
Well, Borges felt that he must have been a disappointment to his mother, certainly. He does say that as a young boy he felt he could not become a man of action, and that in itself would have made him somehow unworthy in his mother's eyes. But on the other hand, he had a very different impression from his father. His father was a very different character from his mother. His father was half English. Borges' father was bilingual, and Borges himself grew up bilingual. Was a self-doubting personality. He was a man who graduated in law but wasn't happy with that. He tried teaching psychology, wasn't particularly happy with that either. He really wanted to be a writer. And yet, however much he tried as a poet and as a novelist, he failed. He published one novel which didn't do very well. So Borges' father was, if you like, discontented with his position in Argentina, as opposed to the mother, who was very proud of her patrician ancestry. So they form a kind of strange, conflicted dynamic for Borges when he's young.
And he lived with her until she was 99. So.
Yes, indeed.
Evelyn Fishburn, despite this great affiliation to Argentina, the Borges family left in 1914 and went to Geneva. Why did they go there, and what effect did it have on him?
Well, they went there originally because of his father's failing eyesight and for him to have an operation there. And then they were caught by World War I in Geneva. There were father, mother, sister, and the maternal grandmother. So the household moved together, as it were. The Geneva years were enormously formative for his intellectual and his emotional makeup. He said later on in life, in a work called Atlas, that of all the cities in Europe, Geneva is the most propitious to happiness. And I think this reflects the happy years that he spent, his late teens, in Geneva. It would be just too long a list to say what he learned there. I mean, he already was, as Edwin mentioned, completely bilingual. To Spanish and English, he added French, he added Latin, and he taught himself German. He read widely in French literature. English literature he continued to read. He discovered Walt Whitman, and he said that from Walt Whitman, he got the joy of writing, of being in the world and writing. But I'll come to German because I think that's the most impressive. He taught himself German through reading Heine. This allowed him to go where he wanted to go, that is, to read Schopenhauer in the original, which he did. And Schopenhauer was a great influence in his life. He met two friends, Jewish friends, Abramovich and Hitchlinsky, who remained friends, close friends, till the end of his life. And from then he got not only the warmth of friendship, which he hadn't had before, in Argentina perhaps, the introduction to culture in general, and love of culture, and to Jewish culture in particular.
Was there any pressure on him to have a career outside writing, or was he encouraged to be this bookish young man who interested in the avant-garde when they moved to Spain on the way back to Argentina?
There was no pressure for him to do anything but write, and even that there was very little pressure on him then. The only pressure came when he had an accident in 1938, and that's when
much
he started
later, yeah.
writing.
So we've got a young man who's immensely well-read, learned in languages, teaching himself about literatures, encountering the avant-garde, intellectuals in Geneva, and then he'd go back through Spain, the avant-garde in Spain, and goes back to Argentina, Efraín Kristal. He began in literary journalism. Can you tell us about his early writing career?
Yes, I mean, when he came back to Argentina, he was very much involved in literary journals. He wrote articles for the Sunday newspaper. He also worked in women's journals. And this is quite extraordinary because in his work in women's journals, he began to infuse his prose with the works of many writers that were completely unknown to Argentina, thereby educating Argentine women in fashion magazines. Any number of extraordinary writers, Schopenhauer, Thomas Mann, Kafka, T.S. Eliot, began to be talked about in Argentina. And these early articles were the seeds to some of his most extraordinary contributions to the essay. For example, the essays on T.S. Eliot were the seeds to these wonderful essays he later wrote about writers creating their own precursors, about the realities that literature creates, and the reinterpretations that we must take on board with respect to previous writers once a new writer comes into being. This was the experimental ground for some of his most interesting ideas.
It's fascinating because a lot of listeners would think it's almost impossible to think about a writer who became a writer of such major seriousness as Borges, starting off in women's magazines in this country then or now or at other times.
Well, I don't think it's quite true to say that he started off writing women's magazines. In fact, in the 1920s, after he returned to Argentina, he, in a sense, founded the Argentine avant-garde. At that time, he was actually a poet, and he had already made his mark in the Spanish avant-garde in Madrid. But in Buenos Aires, he became a very important poet, and he considered himself at that time as a poet. He didn't see himself as a writer of fiction. He wrote 3 books, Fervor of Buenos Aires, Moon Across the Way, and San Martin Notebook. And in these books, you can see, and in his literary essays of the 1920s, you can see a very different Borges from the Borges that became famous later on. He's a very impassioned poet. He's an expressionist poet, influenced by German expressionism, and a great, great admirer, as Evelyn said, of Walt Whitman.
Can I go back to Efraín then to talk a little bit about these 3 books of poetry? There were fewer and fewer poems in these 3 books of poetry, and as I understand it, he was influenced by a love affair he was having, which turned out to be a very unhappy one. But can you talk to something about the background of the poetry, and then a little about what.
Yeah. After the experience in Geneva and the experience in Madrid, in which he first brought German Expressionism from Geneva to Madrid, and then became very engaged with avant-garde movements in Madrid, he returns to Argentina and he writes, I think, this remarkable book, Fervor of Buenos Aires, a remarkable book of poems, which was not that well received or understood when it came out, but I think it's an extraordinary work in that it's a work that in which he infuses into the city of Buenos Aires a metaphysical aura that will also characterize some of his other works in the future. You begin to see the seeds of any number of themes that will later on reappear in his work. The theme of a world as a labyrinth, the theme of circular time, the theme of the paradoxes of the mirror, are all beginning to be worked out in this book. And you also have this extraordinary persona, a persona that identifies itself with objects and things and streets and then becomes them, as if a collective will is creating the world in which you live. These early poems, which are wonderful, were, as I said, were not that well understood or even that well received at the very beginning, and yet he was very proud of them. He knew that he had done something important, and I think you have the seeds of many things that were to come.
In that time, was, as I understand it, Edwin was his great love affair with Nora Lang. Can you describe what part that played? Because it seems to have played an important part in his development as a writer.
His first great love affair was with Concepcion Guerrero, a young girl, and this was the love affair he was, if you like, having whilst he was writing Fervor de Buenos Aires, and you can trace the effect of his love for Concepcion Guerrero in those poems. But later in the 1920s, he breaks with Concepcion Guerrero, and he becomes fascinated and infatuated with this young woman poet who was his mentor and part of his group, and this was the red-haired woman Nora Lang of Nordic ancestry. And we don't know whether, in fact, she was fully reciprocated in this love affair, but clearly she, like Concepcion Guerrero before her, infused his enthusiasm and his passion for writing. He had, as I was saying earlier, Whitman as his hero, the idea of poetry. Poetry's highest goal was to write in a kind of rapture in which you would feel at one with your city, with the world. And then, of course, what happens then is that in 1926, Nora Lang falls in love with Borges' arch-rival on the avant-garde, a poet called Oliverio Girondo. And when she falls in love with Girondo, this, I believe, was a personal disaster for Borges and provides the seed for his eventual abandonment of poetry and his turn towards fiction, essay writing around about 1929, 1930.
Evelyn, you wanted to say?
Yes, I wanted to say that what I find most interesting about his love affairs is how he translated this experience immediately into literature. I think that's where the greatness of the man lies. It's because of his fiction that we are talking about him so much today.
Nevertheless, his life had an effect on his fiction.
Oh, absolutely.
You talked earlier about the serious accident in 1938.
Yes,
absolutely. Can you just describe what that was and why that had an effect on his literature?
Well, he was rushing up to meet a woman, and he brushed himself against an open window, and he suffered from septicemia. And he was in a coma for about 8 days. He describes that, the hell of being in this coma. And after that, he thought he might have lost his mind. So he tried his first fiction because he thought if he fails on this, it doesn't really matter. He hadn't succeeded before. It's a new genre. But he didn't. He wrote this wonderful, wonderful story, Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote.
Can I talk, Edwin Williamson, can you briefly, I'm afraid, tell us about this story, Pierre Menard, the author of Don Quixote?
Well, as Evelyn has just pointed out, it emerges from a personal crisis, that accident Christmas Eve 1938, but we must also remember that Borges' father, with whom he had a very troubled relationship, died in February of 1938. And in some ways, Pierre Menard is a story about troubled relations between sons and fathers. It's a story about a French writer in the 20th century who decides he wants to repeat Cervantes' great masterpiece, Don Quixote, not by copying it out, but somehow by writing it from scratch so that it will coincide line by line and word for word with Cervantes. Now, you can see that in a sense it's a story about a literary parricide, because if Pierre Menard had succeeded in actually writing or rewriting the whole of Don Quixote, then he would really have knocked Cervantes off his pedestal as the great father figure of the novel, the great father figure of Spanish literature. So that, in a sense, by doing that, Pierre Menard was trying to deprive Cervantes of his unique authority as the creator of Don Quixote. In a sense, it's an attack on the whole concept of literary originality.
Evelyn, you were trying to get in.
Well, I'll just come in. George Steiner said of Borges that he was a miniaturist, and I think it's important to bear this in mind. We need to stress that Borges was neither a philosopher nor an ideologue, nor perhaps even a very original thinker. He was a very original writer, fiction writer, and it's what he did with these insights. He had insights which were later developed, and he is de rigueur, as a quotation, as an epigraph to Foucault, Baudrillard, Genet. They all have a sentence of Borges to introduce what they then systematize.
Perhaps his best-known story, Efraín Kristal, is The Garden of Forking Paths. His stories play on lots of levels at once. In one way, it's a detective story. He brought popular genres into his writing. And can you just give us some idea of that? Then I'm trying to give the listeners who might not know Borges' work some idea of the actual works themselves before we move on to discuss them further.
Sure. It's a wonderful story, The Garden of Forking Paths. Borges had just translated Henri Michaud's A Barbarian in Asia, which is a story, which is of course the idea that a European is, as a barbarian, is living in Asia. And then he begins to think, well, what if I invert what Michaud has done, and I tell the story of an Asian in Europe? So he imagines this individual, Yu Tsun, a Chinese man who has very little sympathy for Europeans, who is living in London and working as a spy for the Germans during the First World War. And then he gets involved in a mission. And the mission, he realizes that in order to fulfill his mission, he must kill randomly an individual called Albert, who he seeks out in a phone book. And when he meets this Albert, who he needs to kill, he realizes that this Albert is an English sinologist who has discovered the secrets of his own past. And the secrets of his own past involved a strange character who he thought was strange, an ancestor who at first wanted to create an infinite labyrinth to entrap all of his people, and gives up this project to write a book that was supposed to be, that was received as a strange and incoherent book. And yet the book that this man wrote is a book that has prefigured not only what Yu Tsun is living at the moment, but also many other possible worlds in which sometimes he appears and sometimes he doesn't appear. And when he realizes all of this, his sense of keeping faith to himself and his sense of showing that he is superior to his Europeans compels him to kill this man in any event.
And ring up London and say, job completed.
He doesn't have to ring. He
doesn't have to ring. No, it's a piece in the newspaper.
That's right, because he knows that that when his name is associated to the murder of Albert, the Germans will know what to do.
Can you summarize then, Edwin, how this play with reality and fiction and the imagination and so on? It goes into, as we might even call, hoax book reviews and so on. Can you give us a generalized idea?
Yes, I mean, Borges was a great literary prankster. He was a bit of a trickster, and he liked playing games, blurring the divisions between reality and fiction. He used to, for example, introduce real friends of his into his fictions, like his friend Bioy Casares into Tlön, or he would write a story in the form of a scholarly article and introduce notes and allude to non-existent books. An example is a story he calls The Approach to Al-Mutasim, which he first published in 1935, and it purports to be the first detective novel ever written by a native of Bombay. And he discusses the plot of the 1932 edition. Then he goes on to discuss the changes to that plot in the 1934 edition. And he says that the first edition, written by this Indian lawyer, was reissued by Victor Gollancz in London with a prologue by Dorothy L. Sayers. Now, so convincing was this spoof that Borges's friend, Adolfo Bioy Casares, who was also a writer, sent off to his bookseller in London to order that book, which of course was non-existent. So Borges loved this kind of thing.
Coming back to you for a moment, Evelyn, he knew that he would go blind. Now, I know you don't like as much of the interaction between the life and the work, but that was an enormous factor for somebody who seemed to, prefer books to, not some people say life's a thing, but I prefer books. How did that affect his writing, his literature? Because he went blind in his late middle age.
Well, he then wrote mainly poetry, things that were more contained. But it's always been a source of great wonder to me and to everybody else, the way in which he remembered things that he had read, and he continued to live in his past reading. And of course, he had people reading to him all the time. His mother read to him, and anyone who spoke English had instant access to Borges in Argentina, because he would just say, "Oh, come along and read to me." So I think that in a way he continued very much in the literary world, involved in a very vivid, alive way.
Do you think it had any influence on what he wrote about and the way he wrote about it?
It must have done. I mean, as you said before, with everything, and he once said something about a man thinks that he's writing about this, that, and the other, mountains and rivers and whatever, and in the end it's the patient labyrinth that he has traced are the lines of his own face. But can I just say something, because it causes a lot of misunderstandings with the hoaxes, and Edwin is quite right when he talks about the hoaxes, and it's something that is important in his work because it appears so often, but not quite as often as we think. I've done a lot of work on illusion in Borges, and I've always found that although he uses the illusion counterculturally, he might say somebody wrote something that they didn't write, but the person is right, to give it an air of veracity. On the whole, you can see what it is that he is setting up, and on the whole, there aren't that many allusions that are false. The vast majority of them are apposite allusions, which he then creates an interplay between what he has misquoted. He misreads creatively, in Bloom's own term, what he has misquoted and how he's applying it. And I think that is where a lot of the inventiveness of his work resides.
I think we must move to translation here, Efraín Kristal. He was greatly interested in it, as I think I've said. He translated, in a way, Oscar Wilde's Happy Prince when he was about 9. But he was doing a lot more than translating, wasn't he? Can you explain why that was and what he was doing?
And one of the remarkable things about Borges as a translator, and it actually begins with this first translation, which was published, I think, in 1910 in a newspaper in Buenos Aires, The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde, is that he wouldn't simply translate, he would actually often modify. And even in that translation, in the translation of Oscar Wilde's The Happy Prince, he changes the gender of a character, so that a male swallow becomes a female swallow in his story. And in doing that, he has to rearrange all kinds of other things in order for the story to work out. Female adjectives become male adjectives, and so on. And this is really a pattern. He translated throughout his life. The number of works that he translated are massive. And oftentimes, he would make very important changes. I mean, for example, in his translations of Walt Whitman's poetry, he would introduce sometimes infinite regresses in poems where there weren't any. In his translation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Purloined Letter, he changes the gender of the main character of the story. In the original, in Poe's original, the main character of the story is a woman and probably the Queen of France. In his translation, it is probably a man who works at the royal palace but has no royal status. And when Borges talked about that story in interviews, he would talk about the man. And he was criticized for misunderstanding the story, and he would reply, no, he was referring to his translation of the story, not to Poe's original.
What do you think? And as I understand it, he did the same with Faulkner and Kafka, whom he introduced to an audience who had not met them before, saving his translation. What's your view about the liberal way in which he translated these authors?
Of course, when he took these liberties, he took these liberties at a time in which most of these authors were completely unknown, at least in the context of Latin America. So he could get away with a lot of things that no one could get away with today. And I think that what's extraordinary about the liberties that he took is that you get, on the one hand, a window into his creative process. You really can see this literary genius, this literary mind at work in very specific ways. And at the same time, I think that in broader terms, the liberty, the kind of spirit that brought this liberty into the translation, also was a great sense of gave a great sense of liberation, not just to him but to many other Latin American writers, with respect of how they could use and transform many other works of literature.
Edwin Williamson is fascinated by translators. They appear in his stories too. But what's your view of his translations as translations when most people nowadays are still extraordinarily fastidious about this?
I see that really as appropriations as much as translations, because what Borges was doing is, again, playing with texts and trying to demonstrate the fluidity of these texts, that they could, they were all, in a sense, I think it all stems from Borges' very strong belief that however magical and beautiful language was, it was in some sense insufficient to describe the fullness of reality. And I think that, in a sense, language is a symbolic system, so therefore words themselves cannot comprehend or fully represent reality. That means that any kind of human discourse is, to some extent, a fabrication, an invention, a fiction. And once you adopt that position, then you can play around with discourses, trying to show their inherent limitations, their inherent arbitrariness, but also they become the playthings of the writer. And in some respects, then, for Borges, a translation is inherently something that can betray. Traduttore, traditore, well, that for him is the intrinsic nature of language. Language necessarily betrays its relationship, so it falls short of reality. So it's a kind of a betrayal in its very representation of reality.
Evelyn, and back to Abraham.
What I wanted to say is, on language, language can't represent the world adequately, and there's a wonderful story, Funes the Memorious, in which Funes, who has had an accident and has total vision and total memory, cannot understand that one should have the same word, dog, for the dog seen at 3:14 from the front and 3:15 from the side. But of course, Funes dies of congestion, pulmonary congestion, because he's weighed down by all this knowledge and he can't do anything with the knowledge. And I think that what we are saying points to the thing. It's not just that language is unknowable, it's that reality is unknowable, the universe is unknowable, God is unknowable. And that brings me to perhaps the most important metaphor of Borges, and that is the labyrinth. And I'm coming back to an original point that I made about his readings in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, which, of course, he read totally unorthodox, in an unorthodox way, counterculturally. But what he got from there, what fascinating, is that is a central strategy, to use that word, in his stories is the idea of an eternal truth, an eternal text, the word of God, which is not knowable to man. So that is, as it were, the labyrinth. God may or may not see the center of that labyrinth, but man errs in the labyrinth, in the different paths of the labyrinth, trying to get to that truth.
Can I bring Efraín for a moment, then back to you, Efraín?
I mean, what I wanted to do was actually tie some of the points actually that Evelyn just made, but to the nitty-gritty of the process of Borges's writing. For example, he loved to translate works of writers who were already transforming works of others. For example, he translated the cruel stories of Villiers de l'Isle Adam, and Villiers de l'Isle Adam wanted to make famous cruel stories even crueler. So, for example, when Villiers de l'Isle Adam rewrites Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum, you have a situation like Poe's in which an individual is in a pit, and like Poe, you think that this individual is escaping. But no, Villiers calls the story The Torture of Hope, because the character thinks he is escaping, he's actually not escaping, he will be killed, it is the torture of hope. When Borges translates the story, he eliminates the theological differences between the Dominican priest in Villiers' story who tortures a Kabbalistic rabbi, because these theological differences would have mitigated the cruelty of the story. And he changes the title from The Torture of Hope to Hope because the title had given away the ending. Now, Borges realized that by eliminating the theological elements of that story, he made it better, he made it crueler. But he also realized that a nice literary idea had fallen by the wayside when Villiers treated the theme. So then he writes a story called The Writing of the God, in which an apocryphal priest in the pit deciphers the writing of his God, could obliterate his torturer, could obliterate the universe, but this knowledge that he has gained is so overwhelming and so powerful that he allows himself to die.
Can I just pick up on that? Because this is exactly the point I was hoping to make. That I think one overlooks an important theme in Borges, and that is the theme of mystical illumination. Conventionally, critics tend to dwell on his belief in the insufficiency of language, the idea of all human discourses are, in a sense, fictional, the idea that words fall short of reality. But for that very reason, there is a deep yearning in Borges to transcend language, and you cannot know the world through reason, you cannot know the world or describe it or comprehend it through language. The only way is through some instant revelation, through some mystical illumination. Now, Efraín has mentioned the writing of the God, the God's writing. I can also think of the Aleph, where you have Borges' attempt to try and write in a way which would represent, although that's condemned to failure, but would represent a God's vision of the universe, where everything within the universe could be perceived in one eternal instant. You've also got The Congress, for example, which is his longest short story. And there you have a wealthy rancher who wants to create a Congress of the world and have a representative of each nation, language, a book, tries to look for a universal language. And then he realizes that all that is futile. And he receives a kind of mystical illumination which gives him and the members of the secret society a sense that they're all part of pantheistic unity. So I think this is a countervailing tendency in Borges.
Evelyn?
Yes, I absolutely agree. But on the other hand, I think one has to read Borges always with the idea, with his skepticism in mind, with irony in mind. To mention just the Aleph comes under mind. The Aleph being, in the story, a small coin, a microcosm, of course, in which is reflected the whole of the universe. He has this fantastic experience of seeing the Aleph, and he comes out of the Borges-like character, comes out of the cellar and commits an act of absolute petty vindictiveness. And then the Aleph is deconstructed by saying that there are many Alephs, either here, there, and everywhere. And there he has that fantastic passage, I saw, and everything that he sees in the Aleph, the total vision. But this total vision doesn't lead to anything other than vindictiveness and to a long list of other mirrors in literature which mirror the universe, and the Aleph itself, which is in Cantor's theory of the Mengenlehre, where any number can be symbolic of any number. So in a way, he doesn't trivialize, but he dilutes the experience by showing that actually it is everywhere and available everywhere.
I think there's a dialectic throughout Borges' work between, if you like, writing like Whitman, this impassioned expressionist ecstatic writing as rapture, and writing, if you like, in the vein of Kafka, which is that of a disabused, disillusioned, endlessly ironic, neurotic writer. And at every stage in Borges' work, you'll find that either the Whitman aspiration or the Kafka practice will be present in some degree. And I think this is why, on the one hand, in the Aleph, you got the yearning to have that mystical illumination, but on the other hand, you have the undermining of that yearning because of his having to write within human discourse.
Efraín, you wanted to come in there.
Yes. I mean, one of the other things that I think is wonderful about Borges is that Borges was fascinated with many philosophical and theological perplexities. And he had this acumen which allowed him to turn those philosophical and theological perplexities into very compelling and very attractive literary ideas. So he's the kind of writer that beguiles and disconcerts with exactly the same conceits.
Borges' reputation suffered more than a little because of his political allegiances. Edwin, he was sympathetic to fascist dictatorships in Argentina, in Chile, and in Spain. Do you think that it had a very bad impact on his reputation?
Well, this reputation he acquired in 1976, in the late 70s, with his declarations in support of Pinochet and General Videla and even General Franco, who died the year before, really became an albatross round his neck. And even today, he has this reputation of being a political reactionary. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth.
But he did declare his support.
He did, but you have to see that in the context of his whole political development. In fact, Borges, in his youth, was a supporter of the Radical Party in Argentina. He was a social democrat, if you like. He even became actively involved. He saw himself as a public intellectual. And in a sense, Borges always saw himself as a public intellectual. At every major juncture in Argentine history, Borges took a position and took a public position and declared himself for a particular stance. And in the 30s, he was one of the leading intellectuals in Argentina to speak out against anti-Semitism, against the Nazis, against anti-fascism, and against the rise of a right-wing Catholic nationalism, which eventually spawned Perón and Evita. And it was this opposition to Perón, I think, which perhaps marked his later political ideas.
What he did in the end of the 70s is less easy to explain away, but I know you're a magnificent apologist for him, as we've heard in this programme. I just wondered, let's stick to that. I mean, he supported 3 fascist dictators, and most of the people who loved his work would not do so, or not have done so, and be very disappointed, to put it mildly.
He did recant within a year or two. I mean, he did realise that he'd made a mistake, and when...
He realised he'd made a mistake, or realised he was wrong?
He realised he was wrong to support Pinochet and Videla, particularly Videla. He realised that he had misconceived what they were about. He thought that they would overthrow the last Peronist government and then prepare the ground for the return of democracy, and he realised he was completely wrong there. And when news of the disappearances and the dirty war came out, he strongly spoke in support of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and he campaigned for the bringing to justice of those military personnel responsible for these disappearances. And towards the end, he described himself as a pacifist and an anarchist.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to ask you, and if you can't bear to do it, that's perfectly all right by me. Just to briskly tell us what you think his legacy is. Can I start with you, Efraín Kristal?
Well, I think that Borges is a writer that has allowed many readers to consider the possibility that the impossible and even the preposterous can be sometimes more compelling than the real.
Evelyn.
Well, I'd like to quote something that Borges said, and that is, if I'm rich in anything, it is in perplexities, not in certainties. And I think he has destabilized received truths without negating them completely. I think whenever you read him, you've got to read him against something that he had said, a sort of declaration at the end of an essay, and yet denying time. And then he says, the world is real, I unfortunately am Borges. So there's this sort of realist credo and the perplexities of which he is proud, and I think we have to always read with that interplay, because the fact that every story has its own counter-argument is extremely important. So we mustn't say Borges is against time, chronological time, or Borges is against individuality, but just show the tension that there is between individual time, subjective time, and chronological time, say, as in The Secret Miracle.
Finally, Edwin.
Well, I think his literary legacy, I mean, he did influence a lot of writers, not just in Argentina and Latin America, but in Britain, the US, France, and Italy. I think what he does is he actually rehabilitates fantasy as a vital resource of the serious writer of fiction, and he also expands the bounds of serious fiction by allowing writers to actually write in the vein of a folk tale, fable, parable, an obituary, a book review, and so on. So it extends the range. His use of fantasy, all right, he is in a sense the father of magic realism broadly understood, but what he does is he introduces fantasy into an otherwise realistic setting as a tool through which he can then explore philosophical, ethical, and in some cases historical and even philosophical issues. On a broader cultural level, I think his legacy is he's a writer for a post-religious age. I mean, at the end of his life, he said that doubt was the most precious gift of all. And doubt was creative in that sense. It opens up the possibility of dreaming. At the very end of his life, he said that he had never achieved anything through the intellect. He was simply a weaver of dreams. So he elaborates this semi-mystical view of writing as a form of dreaming, where the writer is a kind of almost involuntary medium for some mysterious power.
Well, thank you all very much indeed for introducing a great number of listeners, I'm sure, to a writer they'll be absolutely fascinated by. Thank you very much, Evelyn Fishburn, Efraín Kristal, and Edwin Williamson, and thank you for listening.